the moon is artificial. There's overwhelming evidence that the moon is artificial.
Wow.
And without the moon, we would not have these equinoxes and these solstices. That the moon is 1/400th the size of the sun, and it is exactly 1/400th the distance of the Earth from the sun. Okay, it was set up that way in order to create the symbol that is the solar eclipse and the predictive device that is the solar eclipse, which can be used by a priesthood to manipulate a society. Although I've always been open-minded to ESP and PK and various types of parapsychological evidence, I was always very resistant to looking at astrology. Evidence for the efficacy of astrology kept being thrown in my face. And finally, I had to take a more serious look at it. And in particular, I looked at the research of Michel Gauquelin, a Belgian scientist, who did a study of correlations between planets in certain people's natal charts and the professions that they wound up going into, like soldiers or athletes or entertainers and so on and so forth. And he's produced astronomical odds against chance correlations between the dominant planet in somebody's natal chart and the type of career that they go into. And so I suspect that this society, which somehow built with 1,300-ton stones at Baalbek and 400-ton stones at Giza, this society engineered a psychosocial control system which tried to determine people's personality based upon when they would be conceived and when they would be born. And it was an extremely hierarchical caste society, and it was planned down to the level of detail required to be able to, on average, turn out certain types of people at certain times. Let's say if you were going to be in the soldier caste, you could only be conceived at a certain time of the year so that you would be born at a certain time with a certain type of natal chart. And they created basically a vast system of psychokinetic influence using the stars as symbolic structures, as a kind of software mesh interfacing with consciousness in order to guide different types of people into different roles in this society. And that when, let's say we want to call it Atlantis, like Plato does, when Atlantis was destroyed, this system persisted on an etheric level, albeit in ruins, so that its echoes are still with us today on a psychical level. People who've studied psychokinesis in the field of parapsychology are familiar with an idea called a PK field. So that if somebody who's an adept at psychokinesis engages in intensive psychokinetic influence in a particular place, the field of influence that they set up may endure for some time after. There's a lag effect. If Atlantis was a historical reality, and I believe there's overwhelming evidence that it was, that's a civilization that endured for tens of thousands of years longer than the one that's in our history books. Namely, this so-called history that we have that goes back 5,000 years. Well, that's nothing compared to, an Atlantis that potentially went back tens of thousands of years. So the imprint of that type of social system on our subconscious is so deep that astrology still works, even though there's no objective truth to it. It's a system that was set up in order to shape society, and it still has a hold on our subconscious. And therefore, you still see the kinds of correlations that somebody like Michel Gauquelin came up with in his research on, career paths and natal charts.
Yeah, my question for Dr. Jorjani is this where you see, for example, the idea of the 12 constellations being prominent throughout cultures that go from China all the way over to the Native Americans, and they're all using the same numerology? And a part two of that question is, I just recently found out that the ancients gave your birth chart not based on when you were born, but based on when you were conceived. And the Suetonius talks about Augustus, who is called the son of God, the illustrious one. He's the king of the world, basically. He's a Capricorn. He was conceived 10 months before he was born in September, which brings him back to December 25th. I just found this out. My mind was blown away. So what's up with these equinoxes and solstices, and what's so powerful about them?
There are nuances in Chinese astrology that are different from, Greco-Roman astrology, but there are way too many similarities in these astrological systems than there ought to be if we were dealing with a bunch of disconnected civilizations that evolved on their own, as our conventional history books taught us, when we were in school back in I don't know what they even teach these days. I don't think I doubt that anything resembling history is even taught these days, considering the dominant discourse in academia. But certainly this narrative that we were fed back in the day about all these independently arising civilizations is a bunch of nonsense. And you can see that in these astrological systems. There's no reason, physically speaking, why astrology should work. I mean, I can understand the moon having an influence on human behavior, right? I mean, moon madness is a real thing, as anyone who works in an emergency room knows. And there's no mystery there. I mean, considering the percentage of water that constitutes our body and the tidal effect of the moon on the Earth's oceans, that stands to reason. There's no reason why the planets gravitationally should have the effect that they do on shaping human personality and, let's say, the career path someone would take, let alone these arbitrarily determined star constellations. I mean, you could have come up with any number of other lines that you could draw through stars to, make for other constellations than the ones that we have. Clearly, somebody at one point arbitrarily determined this symbol system and then put it to a certain use. A use which I think included social engineering. You would have a different symbol system on Mars. And again, it could have been carved up a different way even on the Earth. So therefore, what it suggests to me is that this is something like software that was designed by a group of people at one point to interface with consciousness on a social scale. And then the last part of what you were saying was in terms of the equinoxes and the solstices and what is all that? Well, that takes us into one of the most controversial subjects in my book, Closer Encounters, which is that the moon is artificial. There's overwhelming evidence that the moon is artificial.
Wow.
And without the moon, we would not have these equinoxes and these solstices. Okay, I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why you would engineer the moon, which is a subject we can unpack slowly over time if you want to go there. And those reasons have everything to do with making the Earth even a habitable planet for a humanoid form of life. Because without the moon, the Earth, for example, would be rotating way too fast for anything like humanoid beings to have evolved on its surface. But it goes all the way to the level of how symbology can be used to manipulate social consciousness. Think about the power that predicting eclipses had in various societies, where you had astrological priesthoods that had foreknowledge of eclipses. Notice that these eclipses would not be possible but for the extremely bizarre and I don't believe coincidental fact that the moon is 1/400th the size of the sun, and it is exactly 1/400th the distance of the Earth from the sun. Okay, it was set up that way in order to create the symbol that is the solar eclipse and the predictive device that is the solar eclipse, which can be used by a priesthood to manipulate a society. So, when you ask about the equinoxes and the eclipses, I think it's part of a system that was set up here, a control system. After all, you titled this program, Who Controls Our Reality? A big part of this matrix of control that we're in has to do with this machine, the Death Star that's floating above us.